Chapter 41. Dwarf's Honesty. The White Witch really was letting him go so easily? Eno was taken aback, for a moment wondering if his ears were deceiving him. He had expected her to force him to join her side. He certainly hadn't expected such a light dismissal. He stood frozen, uncertain what to do. The witch seemed to read people like an open book. "Who do you think you are? The deep magic?" she snapped. "I froze Narnia for 100 years without needing anyone like you." The brief warmth in the garden died instantly. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," Eno began. "Out, pack your things, take your belongings, and get out of my castle. I'll have a vulture give you a ride." Faced with her rage, Eno felt a chill of real intimidation. He also chastised himself for hesitating earlier. There was no point in arguing, like a dragon who doesn't bother lying to a sparrow. He bowed slightly and retreated without another word. Castle Tower. The dwarf Simon produced a horn and blew a long, low blast. After 5 or 6 minutes, a black shape appeared in the distance and streaked toward the tower. With a gust of wind, a giant vulture settled before them, easily 10 feet tall, with a wingspan of more than 20 feet, more than capable of carrying a rider. Eno studied the bird with a measure of relief. He had considered leaving by land, but the dark army massed on the ice outside the castle made that impossible. It wasn't only that no one dared defy the witch. With war looming, he had no desire to throw himself into a fight he couldn't win. If you lack strength, don't go looking for trouble. That had always been his rule. The vulture was the best, fastest option. As he hoisted his suitcase, the dwarf broke his silence. "Wait a moment, guest." His voice was unexpectedly soft. "I know I shouldn't say this, I'm no one, but old Simon won't be around long. I might as well speak plainly." Eno turned and crouched to meet the dwarf's eyes. "Thank you for your care these past 3 months. I haven't properly thanked you. Speak freely." Simon stepped forward, placed a hand over his heart, and bowed deeply. "Thank you. Thank you for everything you've done. The Queen hasn't been this pleased in a long time. You can't read it on her face, but old Simon has stood by her side for years." He raised his head, his thick beard casting shadows across his features. Up close, Eno noticed details he'd overlooked. The dwarf's eyes were a startling azure, and the pupils bore faint violet patterns, nothing like the gray-eyed dwarves around the castle. Now was not the time to dwell on it, though. Simon resumed talking. "They all say the Queen froze Narnia, but they don't understand. The deep magic rejects outsiders it doesn't recognize. It doesn't even give them a chance. Old Simon's 6 brothers were lost to it." He sounded like a man recounting a long, painful memory. "The Queen wasn't always like this. Old Simon knows. When you first set foot on the snow, she knew everything. You are Narnia's only remaining unrecognized outsider. That's why I drove the sleigh alongside her to fetch you. Only inside the castle could you be safe. Only here could you hide from the deep magic." But now, the dwarf's tone shifted, unusually free of fear. Now it has no time for such things. There was a sort of reckless frankness in his voice that surprised Eno. Outside, the snow stopped. The sky brightened from a dull gray to clear blue, and the great vulture rose and soared. As the ice and snow retreated, the world below stirred back to life. Eno lay on the bird's broad back, watching the thawing landscape, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Simon's words had undone some of the assumptions he'd been carrying about this land. He knew the White Witch came from a faraway place called Charn. The original stories had never hinted at any dealings with Aslan or the deep magic. Now he found himself half believing the dwarf, half doubting him. Emotionally, Simon had no obvious reason to lie, yet reason demanded skepticism. Narnia felt deeper and stranger than any simple tale. "Narnia is too deep," he thought. "Still, I'm only a passerby." After a day's flight, the vulture set them down in a quiet valley. The snow had melted, the earth smelled warm and green, and life hummed in the thawed grasses. For a moment, Eno did not want to leave. He considered staying and watching the story finish itself. He had looked at the dark army on the ice before leaving the castle. The size of that formation meant the decisive battle was only days away. "Time to go back," he murmured to himself, smiling despite everything. When someone returns from a long journey, children always crowd around, for there are countless stories to tell. He hummed a cheerful tune as he checked the valley for signs of wild beasts. He might stay only a few days, but he would not be careless about safety. Chapter 42. The Ancient Magic, Before the Beginning. In Narnia, the stars shone bright that night, though in the western sky most of them had dimmed until only the largest still twinkled. On the stone table hill, a golden shape lay motionless on the old stone slab, and two girls stood beside him, weeping. "We have to untie the ropes." "We can't just leave Aslan like this," Lucy said, reaching out with her small, trembling hands to pull at the bindings. "They're tied too tight. We'll need tools," Susan replied. Though she was no less sorrowful, she kept her composure as the older sister and immediately saw the ropes were too stout to undo by hand. Time moved slowly in the silent night. The air grew colder. The great lion, who had been warm a short while earlier, was now rigid on the table. "Lucy, we have to go back. Peter and the others will worry," Susan said at last, forcing herself up out of her grief. "We must. No buts. We must get back to camp before dawn." Susan helped Lucy to her feet. Dawn was already stirring. A pale light crept along the eastern horizon. As they were about to leave the Stone Table Valley, a thunderous crack split the air behind them, like a giant breaking a great plate. They turned. The stone table had cleft from top to bottom, and Aslan's body was gone. "Wah! This is terrible," Lucy cried. "Who did this? Is it magic again?" Susan whirled, anger and fear both on her face. "Yes," a resonant voice answered behind them. "But this is a deeper magic." The sun rose and Aslan gleamed in the morning light, golden across every hair. He was larger than before. When Susan hurried forward to embrace him, she could only reach his mane by looking up. "You're alive, Aslan," Lucy beamed. "Yes, my dear, I am alive," he said, lowering his head to touch Lucy gently. Susan searched for words she did not have. "But we saw you." "It is like this," Aslan said, looking at Susan. "The White Witch knows an ancient magic, a magic that reaches back to the beginning, to the first dawn of time. But if she had known more, if she could have gone into the silence and the darkness before the beginning, she would have known there is an older magic yet." He told them of what had been done and what had been done to undo it. The idea of such deep, primordial forces was beyond Lucy's grasp, but the gist of it, that something older and stronger than the witch's power had acted, made both girls feel less helpless. "We must go to help Peter and Edmund," Aslan said finally. "We must fight for Narnia, but first, cover your ears." They did as he asked, puzzled but obedient. Then Aslan lifted his head and let loose a roar, huge and clear from the mountaintop, a proclamation of return that rolled across the valley and beyond. Fate can seem fixed, as if things are set and cannot change. Eno had been living alone in a small valley for 6 days. By the third day, the last of the dried cheese and ham in his suitcase had been eaten. He made a mental note. Besides the magic carpet and becoming an animagus, he would have to learn an extension charm. This box could not hold much. "Don't you agree, little one?" he murmured. The little one in front of him was a wooden sprite, no more than a foot tall, with human-like limbs and features and a gentle green glow. She might have been called a wood sprite or a kind of bowtruckle. He had met her while hunting in the mountain forest. Unlike the other wood sprites who could understand speech, this one was dull and simple. She could not speak and seemed scarcely to have thoughts. Perhaps that was why she had followed him, ostracized by her own kind for being foolish. Whatever the reason, she had stayed, and for the past 6 days at least Eno had someone to talk to, even if she did not answer. After his usual confessional to the valley and to the silent trees, Eno turned to the small pile of freshly gathered berries, fruits that tasted of guava and fig. "Separate the pulp," he said. A soft, magical light focused on the pile. The skin peeled away precisely, revealing the red pulp beneath. The berries were sour and astringent, not wonderful to eat, but they were food. After listening to a wild rabbit beg for its life, Eno had gone vegetarian for the time being. The wood sprite, who had been waiting eagerly, waddled over with quick, mincing steps and picked up a berry nearly as large as her head. She sat on the grass, smiling in a simple, satisfied way, and began to eat. Eno was used to such scenes. He suspected she stayed partly because of his feeding, who wouldn't return where there was food. After he ate, Eno stretched on his back and watched the blue sky. The valley was alive. Snow had melted and green had returned, but it was oddly quiet except for the birds. Small animals and many sprites seemed to avoid him. The rabbits had fled, and the other wood sprites kept their distance. He'd asked the dwarf Simon about it. Had he offended the valley? Was there something about him that kept the creatures away? Unable to find an answer, Eno let the question go. He wouldn't be here much longer anyway. As one question left his mind, another arrived. Thoughts of the snow-covered castle, of the white witch in her garden, of dwarf Simon. The valley had a way of making the past feel close. "Merry Christmas, child." The sudden voice made Eno bolt upright. A sleigh had appeared, pulled by 6 reindeer whose antlers were festooned with tiny red hats. The driver was everything the stories promised, a round, kindly old man in red. "Don't be afraid. I mean no harm," the old man said. "I'm just an old fellow who delivers Christmas presents. Mr. Rabbit told me there were still some here who hadn't received gifts, and that's my dereliction of duty, so I hurried back overnight." Eno blinked, the valley and its quiet suddenly full of a new, very different kind of magic. Chapter 43, Santa Claus. The moment Eno saw him, there was no doubt in his mind. Santa Claus of Narnia. Yet the dwarf's words at their parting had left a sliver of unease. There was no other way to read it. This Santa was the most mysterious presence in the whole story. He did not appear often, but every time he did, it was at a turning point. He had been the first to announce that spring was coming to Narnia. He had helped the protagonists grow. In the forest, he had given Peter a sword and shield, predicting they would soon be needed. Not long after, that shy boy used the sword in his first battle and took the first steps toward becoming a true king. He gave Susan a bow and arrows and a horn that would summon help no matter where she was, and later that proved true. The most astonishing gift was for Lucy, a bottle carved from a diamond containing a dew distilled from the Sun Mountain's fire flowers. A single drop could heal the gravest wound, and after the final battle, Lucy used it to save countless injured people, friend and foe alike. Santa's appearances were always clever, timely, and exactly right. Knowing all that, Eno found it hard not to read too much into the moment. Still, the unease was only a flicker. He made a decision. He would not provoke this old man. If Santa wanted to give something, he would accept it. If not, he would not press. He did not want any more incidents before his return. He rose and greeted him. "Merry Christmas, sir. You really didn't have to come all this way. You could have kept the gifts and given them to me next year. It would be the same." "Next year? I'm afraid I may not be able to find you next year," Santa replied with a smile. Even though winter had passed and Narnia bloomed with spring, the words sent a chill through Eno's chest. Santa laughed and waved a hand. "Don't be anxious. I'm just here to deliver gifts, although—" He paused, glanced around, and then continued with a laugh. "Someone else has prepared gifts for you already, but those are another's gifts. What I give is the true Christmas gift." He opened a large red velvet bag on the sleigh. It was half a person's height and packed full, the contents hidden. I can't seem to find your gift. Still, child, tell me what you want. I have a century's worth of undelivered presents." Eno wanted to think, if you're not sincere about giving, why bother? But he kept expression neutral and declined. "Sir, I don't really want anything. If you can't find it, that's fine." "Oh, sunflower dew? By chance I have a small bottle right here, or perhaps books from the primordial era. Heaven knows why no one reads them anymore. They've languished at the bottom of my chest too long." Santa chattered on and began to pull things out. In a short while, many items had been laid on the ground, wondrous trinkets, weapons, and curiosities, even an amethyst scepter like the White Witch's. Nothing ordinary was among them. If Eno thought in terms of game loot, these were all legendary or unique. Even epic items would hardly merit open display. Most intriguing were 3 ancient books that glowed faintly, one ice blue, one fluorescent green, and one dark as ink. Just as he was about to remark, something hit his foot. He looked down. An ancient 6-sided die lay at his feet. Perhaps the pocket had not been reinforced, or his movements were too hasty. The divination die had slipped out. Bending to pick it up, his teacher Hans's voice, more a song than speech, echoed in his mind. "Everything you desire, in truth, controls you." After that brief distraction, Eno calmed himself, picked up the die, and tucked it carefully back into his pocket. When he looked up, his face wore a peaceful smile. "If you insist on giving, then Could I have a pair of cashmere socks? More than any of those treasures, I'd like my feet to be warm in winter. Humph. As I said, I'm only here to deliver gifts. Santa seemed to take note of something and shrugged. Very well, if that's what you want. He reached into the bulging sack and produced a pair of cashmere socks patterned with red Christmas trees. When Eno took them, an odd resolve settled in him. He would give these to Dumbledore this Christmas. He felt unsettled simply holding the socks. He wanted, properly and without theatrics, to greet Santa Claus. How much hatred, how much resentment had been buried to create such a trap. It wasn't just burying someone. It was as if they had dug for underground oil with all their might. All right then, my work here is done. I should be going. At some point, Santa had repacked the displayed items and sat back in the sleigh. You're a lucky child. I look forward to meeting you again. He flicked the reins. The 6 tall reindeer pulled together, and in the blink of an eye, Santa's sleigh had already vanished beyond the valley. Once Santa was gone, Eno sagged to the ground like a released balloon. After a long while, he gathered himself and understood what had nearly happened. His divination at the White Witch's castle had been favorable, and because of the pleasing result, he had let his guard down. Just now, he had nearly fallen into a trap. Santa's appearance was not malicious in itself. He said he was only delivering gifts and even let Eno choose. If anything had gone wrong, it would have been Eno's own greed. The diviner's variables were not part of the prophecy. Oh, little fellow, he muttered to the wood elf who had watched the whole time. I want to go home. I want to get back to Hogwarts. This is too complicated. Quirrell is so much cuter and simpler than him. Chapter 44. End of story. Cair Paravel stood on its high hill above dunes, scattered rocks, and the endless sea. In the great hall, with its ivory ceiling and walls hung with peacock feathers, Aslan solemnly crowned 4 rulers before a gathered multitude. High King Peter, Lord of the Lone Islands and ruler of Cair Paravel, sovereign over all Narnia and its coastal isles. Queen Susan the Gentle, who would govern the wide grasslands north of Archenland and Telmar. King Edmund the Just, Duke of the Lantern Waste and Count of the Western Marshes, ruler of Narnia's western wilds, and Queen Lucy the Valiant, ruler of Calormen. When the ceremony ended that evening, a magnificent banquet filled the castle. People danced and celebrated their hard-won victory. Golden goblets sparkled and wine flowed. In the sea, the merpeople answered the castle music with strange, sweeter songs of their own. Amid the rejoicing, no one noticed Aslan slip away. Only Susan and Lucy saw, and they kept silent. Young Lucy watched his retreating form and quietly bade him farewell. Dawn rose in the east, not only a new day but the beginning of a new era for the land, the bright, civilized age of the 4 monarchs. Far to the north, in a small valley, Eno rinsed quickly in the stream and began to pack. The long dormant stirring had returned, proof enough that the story of Narnia had come to its close. It was time for him to go home. He rolled up the wool blanket, gathered the scattered books, and tucked them into his suitcase. He set aside a few intact berries in his pocket and left the rest piled where they were. Payment, he thought, for the company of the wood spirit over the past days. Dinner's ready, little one, he called, expecting the punctual wood spirit. When there was no answer, he felt puzzled and decided to say farewell at the tree where it had lived. A few minutes later, he stood by that tree. The wood spirit itself was gone. In its place grew an ice-blue rose, like the one he had once glimpsed in the White Witch's garden, a blossom carved of azure crystal, clear and translucent. But whereas the garden rose had been in full bloom, this one was fading. Petals drooped, some hanging precariously. You always see the endings of the stories I tell, Eno murmured to the rose, as if to a friend. Yet you've never wondered whether your life might be someone else's tale. After a long moment, he walked away and then returned with a small handful of valley snow. I'm a free sort, he said, setting the snow at the rose's roots. I don't like being tied down. Still, I owe you something. Perhaps because the ground trembled when he laid the snow, or for some other reason, 2 petals drifted onto the back of his hand. They were cool, not cold. He picked them up and inspected them, an act he would never have dared in the witch's garden. One petal began to melt almost at once, seeping into his palm. Startled, he flicked the other away, but when he looked there was no petal at all on his hand. Instead lay an ice-blue scrap of paper, smaller than his palm and covered in elegant script. It read, "This is your reward. Leave Narnia and stop practicing your half-baked magic. It's not presentable." The tone and the confident voice were unmistakable. It was from the White Witch. Whether the reward was for telling stories or for the snow he had offered, he did not know, and he stopped trying to decide. He took the gift gratefully, all the same. Beneath the brief admonition, the parchment contained a few of the witch's ice spells, few in number because of the paper's size, but each distilled and practical, honed by use. The first described the ice arrow he had seen fired from her sleigh. Not a normal arrow, but a shard of ice, sharper and faster, and capable of being launched in volleys. The rest he skimmed, spells beyond what he expected to master any time soon. Behind him, the ice-blue rose that had trembled beneath the tree vanished like snow in sunlight. "This time truly goodbye, Princess," Eno said aloud and hoisted his suitcase. He walked out of the valley without looking back. He cut a solitary figure on the path. In the slanting light, his shadow stretched long and thin, like a lamppost carrying a suitcase. A typical bard, he had come alone to a strange land, witnessed its tales, and left alone when those tales ended. On the surface, not much had changed, yet everything had. Narnia's bitter winter had passed and spring had come as promised. The story of Narnia was over, but an ending often holds the seeds of a new beginning. Chapter 45. Malfoy is frightened Hogwarts. In the Slytherin dormitory, Eno opened his eyes slowly. After months away, the familiar yet altered surroundings felt like stepping into another world, like waking from a lifetime-long dream, only to find it was all a dream. Logically, after his travels, he should have been used to sudden changes. But this journey had been draining in a way that no quiet stint in small towns, telling stories and biding time, ever had. The contrast was too sharp. "Only Hogwarts makes me feel at ease," he murmured under the heavy bed curtains. He lay back and, exhausted in body and spirit, fell asleep again right there without even taking his boots off, his feet dangling half off the bed. Deep sleep blurs time. Being woken from it is its own torture. Eno had slept for 2 full hours when a clamor filled the dormitory. Chatter, laughter, the kind of noise you'd expect at a boisterous tea. The curtains were whipped aside. "Honestly, can't you be quieter? Isn't the common room big enough for you? Do you have to come here and make a fuss?" The sharpness in his voice was uncharacteristic. Anger snapped out of him before he could stop it. At that instant, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably, a chill that the blazing fireplace couldn't seem to banish. Malfoy and his 2 companions froze, staring at him. Crabbe and Goyle looked openly frightened. Eno felt a prickle of regret. He hadn't meant to be showy, not when he had a plan to follow. He let the stern expression fall away and returned to a familiar, easy smile. With the smile, the cold eased. "Really, can't you all be a little quieter? I only just fell asleep." I'm sorry. I woke you up. We'll go," Malfoy stammered, finding his voice. As if on cue, Crabbe and Goyle sprang up and fled the dormitory like they'd been struck by a spell. "Eno, it's fine," he added quickly, seeing Malfoy hesitate. "I just had a bit of a bad temper from being woken. Don't worry about it." If he could, Eno didn't want to fall out with Malfoy. Aside from losing a convenient human alarm clock, it would be dangerous socially. The Malfoy name still carried weight. Before the final battle, the family's influence reached from the minister's office to the shadowier corners of Nocturne Alley. Having people like that on your side could be very useful. Perhaps it was his smile or some other reason, but Malfoy recovered his composure and relaxed back into himself. "You should smile more, Eno," he said earnestly. "Merlin, you looked terrifying when you were serious, like Professor Snape, or worse." "Don't compare me to Snape," Eno cut in, distracted. "Anyway, what were you 3 talking about so animatedly?" Sensing he didn't want to dwell on anything earlier, Malfoy switched topics at once. "I'll tell you this in confidence. Scarhead and his lot, and that big oaf outside the castle, they've hatched a dragon. I called them over to talk about what to do." Malfoy jabbered on, but Eno's mind had already drifted. Norbert had hatched. Quirrell's life was on its last legs. Sometimes the months at Hogwarts felt like years, yet his memories only sharpened with time. Outside on the lawns near the castle, Hagrid's hut was in chaos. Complaints, sobs, barks from Fang, and low, confused growls from a very young dragon filled the air. Honestly, Hagrid shouldn't have stopped Fang. If he'd let him chase Malfoy, he wouldn't have gotten away, Ron fumed. An hour earlier, their secret with Hagrid had been discovered, and Malfoy had seen the dragon. Ron couldn't imagine what would happen next. He kept expecting a poker-faced Snape to appear from a shadowed corner any moment. Hermione stared at Ron in disbelief. Let Fang chase Malfoy? Are you insane? How would that help? Fang could get hurt, and Hagrid could be in serious trouble. Even if you caught him, what then? Turn him over to the headmaster? She snapped. Hagrid, wiping his eyes, could only blurt, Norbert's so small and already on the verge of being taken away. Harry felt a heavy knot in his stomach. He suspected the news had leaked in the library because of him and Ron. We have to stop Malfoy while there's still time, Harry said with determination, standing. I'll go to Slytherin and talk to him. Are you mad? Ron grabbed Harry's sleeve. Going into Slytherin? To their den? We can't risk losing Norbert and you getting into trouble. Hagrid composed himself enough to add, Harry, don't go. If worst comes to worst, I'll find Professor Dumbledore. He'll know what to do. The plan stalled. Then Ron brightened with an idea. I'll write to Charlie. He's at the Dragon Sanctuary in Romania. If we can't hide Norbert here, maybe Charlie can come for him before anyone notices. No buts, Hermione said. What else are we going to do? Leave him in the Forbidden Forest. Half an hour later, after frantic discussion and a lot of worrying, they reached a decision. Harry would try to talk to Malfoy and keep him calm, while Ron would write to Charlie and ask him to come for Norbert. Chapter 46. Hello, Professor Flitwick. Time always slips by unnoticed. It was the second day after Eno returned from Narnia. Early in the morning, an accordion playing on a timer woke him from a deep sleep. Setting the instrument to play at a certain hour was a trick he'd learned in the valley. In those last tedious days, he had whiled away the time playing and recording tunes. Besides, relying on Malfoy as a human alarm clock wasn't a sustainable plan. Sitting up in bed, he pulled his class schedule from the bedside drawer. Slytherin, first class, charms. Excellent. The White Witch had dismissed charms as a low-level trick, but that never dented his love for magic. When she had gifted him magic, he discovered the real problem. The systems were fundamentally different, like two people talking past each other. The White Witch's power was closer to a Dungeons & Dragons wizard, high-output, turret-style casting built for battle. Hogwarts magic, by contrast, felt more like fairy tales, whimsical enchantments and transfiguration that made wishes come true. One was born for war, the other made for living. If he had to choose, Eno preferred Hogwarts's kind of magic. It was, in the end, about enjoying life. He'd read so many novels and biographies where protagonists spent their whole lives climbing one mountain after another until they stood on a peak. But what then? They'd missed all the scenery along the way. He thought of the story of the fisherman and the rich man. The rich man urged the fisherman to work harder, earn more, buy boats, rent them, and retire to sunbathe at home. The fisherman pointed out that he was already sunbathing. There was no absolute right or wrong, but Eno sided with the fisherman. He wanted to choose his own life. Charms classroom, 6th floor. Professor Flitwick, lively and witty, was explaining the origins of Alohomora and the standard casting technique to the young wizards. He loved to make lessons engaging so students absorbed as much as possible. Today, he'd even brought a giant padlock taller than himself and paired the students up to practice. Losers were theatrically locked in the corner for the remainder of the lesson. 90 minutes flew by in laughter, and the class ended. Most students drifted out. Eno had already packed his books and was reaching the door when Flitwick's voice called behind him. Mr. Swinburne, please wait a moment. Flitwick perched on a chair like a burst of energy. Good day, Professor. Do you need something? Eno turned. He had given up on asking for special tutoring, but 3 months later, unexpectedly, Professor Flitwick was calling him over. Just a chat if you have the time. Of course, it would be an honor, Professor, Eno said easily. He wouldn't refuse a conversation with Flitwick, not even for potions. Flitwick smiled and nodded. I've noticed something since your first charms class. The magic within you is far beyond most of your year. You're a first year in age, but you cast like a third year. And now, Only a week since the last charms lesson. You're casting at about a fourth-year level. His words landed like a small stone. Ino had left the orphanage to try to avoid the accelerated changes to his body. He'd hoped to keep things hidden. Fate, it seemed, could be sidestepped in some ways, but not in others. He could hide his body, not his magic. Flitwick caught the sudden tightness in his face and chuckled. Everyone has their secrets, the professor said. My duty is to teach and guide, not pry. He glanced toward the doorway and saw a cluster of curious faces peeking in. Decades at Hogwarts had taught him what that meant. Calmly, he added, Mr. Swinburne, if you're not rushed, would you come to my office? I have little dancing cakes. Ino, please, Ino corrected reflexively. Going to the office was an honor he gladly accepted. He also admired Flitwick's tact. The professor wasn't leading him away to avoid gossip. The matter could have been silenced with a simple charm, but he was giving Ino a moment to adjust, some time to think of an explanation, so a sudden silence wouldn't feel awkward. In Flitwick's cozy office, the professor produced a plate of golden tiny cakes like a proud child presenting a treasure. Try them. Dancing little cakes, Ino did. The taste was unexpected. It wasn't simply delicious, it tasted like home. Not the thin, watery meals of the orphanage, but proper fried and sautéed dishes, the kind of food you only remembered when you missed it badly. He swallowed slowly, a look of reluctant fondness on his face. Professor, it's magic, Flitwick said, smiling. I baked them with a touch of charm, better than ordering from Honeydukes, I think. Professor, Flitwick asked, leaning back, in your view, what is magic? Eno's mind went to the standard answer from the books and to a question Mad-Eye Moody had once posed. Magic is the quality of casting spells, he said. Two people can cast the same fire charm. I might only light the fireplace, while the same charm from you could burn down a forest. A peculiar analogy, Flitwick laughed lightly, but your fire is capable of more than just lighting logs. His tone shifted, growing serious. Magic reflects who we are. It carries our emotions. Chapter 47, Breaking Through the Fog of Causes and Consequences. Magic, emotions, the inner self. Eno turned Flitwick's words over in his mind. To be honest, he had never thought about these things before. In the wizarding world, there wasn't a single agreed definition of magic. It was more a matter of degree. As a young wizard grew older, the magic inside him increased until it reached a kind of saturation at adulthood. Only a very few could break through that limit and keep growing. But for the most part, magic and spellcasting were distinct. Magic was like an honorary title. Higher magic meant stronger spells. A wizard without that title could still cast, but the effects would be weaker. And that title wasn't consumed. The idea of a wizard running out of magic was nonsense. After a moment, Eno raised his head. Professor, I don't quite follow. I've read that some spells require a wizard's emotions to work, but that doesn't mean magic itself has emotions. Exactly. Emotions, Flitwick said, smiling. I'm glad you read in the library even in your first year. Do you know why? From the moment young wizards arrive at Hogwarts, we emphasize the qualities of the four houses: Ravenclaw's wisdom, Gryffindor's bravery, Slytherin's shrewdness, Hufflepuff's loyalty. Eno opened his mouth to answer, but Flitwick went on. Ha ha! Yes, I used shrewdness, he said, pleased with himself. Did you expect me to say ambition? That's a fool's notion. Yes, many sorted into Slytherin desire greatness. They want fame, wealth, power. But there's another type, rarer than you'd think. Some Slytherins are sorted because of what they strongly don't want. I chose shrewdness for that reason. He paused as if to let Eno think. Wanting wealth and not wanting poverty can be the same force. Those shrewd young wizards, driven by a strong don't want, are sorted into Slytherin because the hat reads emotions. Then Flitwick's voice softened, growing almost wistful. Some people want immortality. Some people simply don't want to die. Ambition and the avoidance of death are expressed differently, yet the hat reads the same core: desire. It's ironic. As the words settled, something cleared in Eno's mind. He knew then why he'd been put in Slytherin: a powerful inner urge, a strong don't want. Deep down, he didn't want to be dragged into the story, didn't want to become close to Harry, didn't want to take part in some future great battle or be caught in its crossfire. Among a crowd of naive first years, a single student with such a layered and intense emotional resistance stood out. To the Sorting Hat's emotional perception, it must have looked like a desire to influence the plot, to control Harry, to take charge of destiny, and above all, a desperate desire to prevent certain outcomes. If the Hat hadn't put someone like that into Slytherin, it would have been an injustice. "Thank you, Professor. I think I understand now," Eno said sincerely. "You're welcome. That's a professor's duty," Flitwick replied, waving a hand. "But that's not all. What I want you to know is that the emotions tied to magic are linked to the house's qualities." He sighed. "Once upon a time, young wizards had a hard time discovering their own natures and often went astray. The four founders created Hogwarts and spent years shaping students' qualities and magical emotions. That process usually works by itself, but your magical growth is unusual, and I worry the shaping can't keep up. That's why I wanted to speak with you." Eno left the Charms classroom thinking. Flitwick had made him reassess magic and wizards. Emotional tendencies could be cultivated from a young age. The houses were the wizarding world's version of instilling values. Flitwick's concern wasn't mere formality, it was a real worry. Dark wizards were, in many cases, the product of twisted emotional development, and adolescents were especially vulnerable. For someone with memories of a past life, mental resilience and an established worldview were advantages. "If I could do it again, I'd definitely go into Ravenclaw," he muttered as he walked across the lawn. He wasn't interested in the Forbidden Forest and didn't understand the appeal of nighttime escapades, but standing at the edge of its shadowed trees had a certain Alice in Wonderland pull, if you ignored the werewolves, trolls, and dark wizards. Then Eno froze. Standing at the forest's entrance was Professor Quirrell, looking even more surprised than he did. The sudden stillness between them felt oddly tense. Quirrell's thoughts were scattered. The fight with the adult unicorn had drained him, and the taint of the unicorn's blood still nagged at him. He reached instinctively for his wand. An inner voice snapped at him. "Don't be an idiot. Greet the student and leave." Quirrell frowned at his own reflex. If he attacked a Hogwarts student in broad daylight, there'd be no trial. He'd be seized and sent straight to Azkaban. "Good morning, Professor Quirrell," Eno said after a moment, already holding his wand in his right hand. His left hand had slipped into his inner pocket. For an instant, he really had thought Quirrell was about to make a move. Hello." Quirrell stammered, clearly flustered. "Student, don't go near the Forbidden Forest. I still have things to do. Goodbye." With that, he hurried off, leaving Eno standing at the edge of the trees. The sensation of brushing past Lord Voldemort was impossible to describe, but mercifully it was over. Quirrell flicked his sleeve and left no trace. Watching the dark shape melt into the castle, Eno couldn't help but let out a long, shaky breath. Quirrell climbed the stairs inside the castle with a new weakness to his step. The terrifying voice that haunted him echoed again in his mind. Find an opportunity to approach that student from earlier. But, Master, what about the plan? Quirrell thought. He couldn't understand the change. His elaborate scheme was on the verge of success. Why this sudden shift? Plan? The voice replied, amused. That plan is a game between me and the dear professor. The only reason the game goes on is because I want to know what he depends on. Master, Quirrell began. Silence. The command cut him off. He swallowed and obeyed. He knew what happened when he didn't. He'd already tasted the pain once. Outside the castle, on the edge of the Forbidden Forest, Eno hadn't realized he'd been singled out by that same voice. It wasn't surprising. If Professor Flitwick could see something that escaped others, there was no reason Lord Voldemort couldn't. Maybe it was just the bystanders' confusion. After Quirrell left, Eno felt no desire to linger. He changed direction and kept walking. He discovered how much the area around Hogwarts contained beyond what books and films had let on. He had expected only the Black Lake and the Forbidden Forest. Instead, there were long bridges for watching sunsets, wide plains to wander, and even an enormous cluster of outbuildings spreading from the castle. Most striking were the herbology greenhouses, square, orderly glass houses stretching in rows like carefully parceled plots across the lawn. Inside were countless pots and plants, green and vigorous in a way entirely different from the eerie, magical green he'd seen elsewhere. If only I'd been sorted into Hufflepuff, he thought idly. I could have had a dorm full of plants. Hufflepuffs, Little badgers, as the students called them, had already bragged more than once about how near their common room was to the kitchens and how stuffed it was with flowers and potted plants. Professor Sprout, their head, was generous to the point of legendary. If a Hufflepuff wanted to grow something, she'd hand over pots, soil, fertilizers, and even the greenhouse without fuss. The defective pots were left piled beside the greenhouses, offered for students to take and reuse. Eno crouched and began rummaging through them. Most were the same, many cracked or chipped, but he enjoyed the small thrill of finding one usable piece amid the refuse, like opening a blind box. He moved from greenhouse to greenhouse, content. Then a soft sound stopped him, the muffled, almost hidden sob that made his stomach tighten with recognition, too familiar. It was the same quiet crying he'd heard in the orphanage, the hurt of someone scalded and hiding in a corner, unable to wail. In the past, he'd often been powerless to help. He didn't want to be powerless now. He remembered something else from earlier that day, a conversation with Professor Flitwick that lodged itself in his head. Don't become the thing people expect. Don't let cunning turn you into something you're ashamed of. The thought settled on him and opened something inside. He repeated a private phrase under his breath. Agile wind, embracing the eagle's azure wings, waiting for the wise to take the crown, and felt a weight lift, as if an invisible hand were easing burden after burden from his shoulders. After years in the orphanage, and later as a spectator in strange worlds, he'd grown cautious, always watching from the sidelines. But now he saw what he truly wanted, the wind and the eagle, free and unrestrained, not the cold, calculating viper that watched without acting. With that clarity, he moved toward the crying. He found the source in a sheltered corner beside the next glass house. A chubby boy in Gryffindor robes, head buried in his knees. Eno knelt and asked, "Soft, are you all right? Can I help?" "No, I don't need anything, thank you," the boy said, still curled up. Then, as if embarrassed at being rude, he lifted his head. His eyes met the green trim of Eno's robes. "Please, Malfoy promised he'd leave me alone today." The words sent a flash through Eno, bullying. That chubby boy was the one who'd been picked on. Connecting the dots, he could see who the bully was. Malfoy's show of bravado and insecurity, the easy target. The name Neville Longbottom came to mind. It fit. Eno smiled in a way he hoped would be gentle and harmless. "Sorry, I don't mean to bother you," he said slowly. "Actually, I wanted to ask for help. I'm trying to grow a few potted plants, but I don't know where to find good soil." He picked his topic with care. For someone who would one day teach herbology, potted plants were an unthreatening, neutral opening, exactly the sort of thing that might make Neville relax enough to talk. Neville had never seen a Slytherin like him before. He recognized the boy as the one Ron had warned him about in the dormitory, someone even worse than Malfoy. The thought of Malfoy made Neville shiver instinctively. Eno sighed, reached into his robe, and pulled out a small berry he'd kept from eating earlier in the valley. "Look, this is the seed. It's from a berry like this." He held it out on his palm. He didn't offer it for Neville to taste, not out of stinginess, but because in the wizarding world, taking food from strangers could be dangerous, and offering might only upset Neville more. Neville stared at the bright green berry for a long moment, then answered softly, "It looks a bit like a fig, but I've never seen one before. I can't be sure." He hesitated, then hastily added, "But those kinds of plants usually like cool, moist spots. You might try digging up some damp soil by the Black Lake." He finished in a small, breathy rush and dropped his eyes like a child who'd said something improper. Eno didn't take offense. He knew how hard it was for someone who'd been bullied to speak at all. He brightened and exaggerated his gratitude. "Thank you, mate. That helps a lot. By the way, I'm Eno Swinburne. I'm a Slytherin." Neville's reply was faint. "I'm Neville Longbottom. I'm a Gryffindor." "Can I call you Neville?" Eno asked. "I'm no expert with plants. I might need to ask you a few things later." "I don't know much," Neville said in almost the same whisper. "I've looked after my Grand's garden. Those flowers did well, but I don't have any deep knowledge." Eno laughed. "Don't worry, this isn't some rare herb. It's just a berry." Half an hour later, Eno was walking toward the castle carrying 2 ceramic flower pots filled with moist soil. He'd kept the conversation with Neville short. For a first meeting, too much talk could be counterproductive. He hadn't promised to make Malfoy stop. There was no point. If Neville didn't gain strength himself, others would always find someone to bully. People tended to flatter those above them and pick on those below. Helping Neville rebuild his confidence was all Ino could do. He couldn't look after the boy forever. A good-looking, pale-skinned boy carrying flower pots drew attention as he crossed the grounds. Some gazes were innocent curiosity. Others were older girls eyeing him with a meaning he didn't like. He hurried his pace. "Pure blood," he said to the stone wall, slipped through before it finished opening, and let out a small breath. Before he'd really caught his breath, a crisp voice called from behind him. "Mr. Swinburne, what are you doing? Are you planting potted plants?" In the Slytherin common room, a corner of girls who had been chattering fell silent the moment he entered. Slytherin's hierarchy showed itself plainly. Status mattered, and friendships were measured. Only Pansy Parkinson stood and came forward to greet him. The others watched. "Good afternoon, Miss Parkinson," Eno replied, polite and composed. "Potted plants? They won't get any sunlight in the dormitory," Pansy said with curious concern. "I have a book about sunlight charms at home. I could lend it to you." Her polite curiosity was a small kindness. Eno remembered Pansy's arrogance with people like Goyle, but she'd always been civil toward him. He decided to accept. "That would be wonderful. Thank you." Pansy smiled, as if she were doing him a favor. "I'll write home soon, by Christmas at the latest." Eno didn't try to read too much into it. Maybe she liked that he shared a dormitory with Malfoy and found him useful. Nothing he couldn't handle. "Thank you. I'll return the favor at Christmas," he said, nodding toward the flower pots. "I'd better put these away now." "Go on, then," Pansy said. "Plant them. I'll write home soon. I won't keep you waiting." Back in his dormitory, the two ceramic pots sat on the table, while Eno let the day roll through his mind. It had been a strange, busy day. A conversation with Professor Flitwick after Charms class in the morning, an accidental run-in with Quirrell near the Forbidden Forest, and then finding Neville by the greenhouse. Events had come in a steady stream, more than he'd experienced in weeks. He looked at the pots and smiled faintly, thinking about what might come next. Chapter 50, Ice and Snow Magic, The Legacy of the White Witch. He sat alone in his dormitory, lost in thought. After a long while, Eno fished the parchment left by the White Witch from his inner pocket. He had chosen a life of unfettered freedom, and he needed the confidence to live it. The White Witch, who had frozen a whole continent for 100 years, was the best teacher he could imagine. He didn't need all of her power. Even half would be enough to let him live freely in the wizarding world. At the desk, he spread the parchment out and studied it carefully. It contained only 3 spells, but each entry explained the incantation, extended uses, and strangest of all, the corresponding emotions required. The emphasis on feeling made him suspect that the White Witch's magic wasn't strictly wizarding in nature. It belonged more to the realm of sorcery. As for the key to learning the spells, the parchment suggested a prerequisite, perhaps the other melted petal he still carried. Time slipped by unnoticed in the quiet dormitory. An hour later, Eno folded the parchment and tucked it back into his pocket. He took several slow breaths, deliberately regulating his mood. He tried to mimic, as best he could from memory, the White Witch's expression, posture, and the particular calm coldness of her emotions. As he did, the temperature in the room began to drop. He couldn't change the weather with a flick of his wrist like the witch, but the damp soil in the 2 ceramic flower pots on his desk frosted over. Frost shot! In midair, a pale blue arrow of ice crystals condensed. After a heartbeat, 2 identical arrows formed beside it. Realizing no more would come, Eno raised his wand and aimed at a blank wall. A flick, and the 3 arrows flew. They struck the wall with a sharp crack. There were no dramatic light shows. The arrows were almost transparent, a pale glimmer, and apart from shattered ice on the floor, the stone was unmarked. Still, Eno was pleased. The arrows were fast, faster than any of his current spell projectiles. They were also subtle. Their translucent blue made them hard to see at a glance, day or night. As for destructive power, the wall held because Hogwarts was not an easy target. The parchment had noted that the White Witch once condensed thousands of such arrows into an impenetrable curtain and annihilated an entire aerial army of griffins. It was a hint at the magic's real strength. superposition. The more power you had, the more arrows you could create and stack together. From his experiment, he learned one practical thing. With his current ability, 3 arrows might not be a strict limit, but it certainly wouldn't climb into the thousands, probably no more than 7. That meant he had to improve condensation speed and aim. If he couldn't saturate an area with arrows, he would have to make precise, lethal shots. For the next hours, he lost himself in practice. Single shots, 3-shot bursts, simultaneous volleys arranged into a crow formation. He even imagined future possibilities, casting without a wand while using a longbow, playing at being an ice archer. He had fun. The dormitory paid the price. The small hearth fire fought bravely against the cold, its thin flames close to being snuffed. Walls, desk, even the bed frame collected frost. Icicles hung from corners. Eno barely noticed. Since arriving in this world, he'd been careful and restrained, never allowing himself real abandon. Now, newly determined to taste freedom, he didn't care about getting caught. Moreover, the cold seemed to suit him. He felt oddly comfortable, even more at ease the colder it became, as if he were built for it. 2 hours later, the dormitory door swung open. "My Merlin, help! Ah!" Malfoy, returning from a day's wandering, froze half through the doorway when a blast of cold hit him. Frost crusted his eyebrows and eyelids. He let out a final, strangled scream and, like a figure of ice, collapsed. The blast had swept into the Slytherin common room. Those still awake there realized immediately that something was seriously wrong. The suddenness and severity pulled Eno from his private thrill into a cold, dawning horror. He had only a moment before prefects and other students acted. Between the bustle, he was stopped by an arriving prefect and then given a summons, one day in the potions classroom with Professor Snape. The hospital wing filled quickly. Malfoy had been born there by the combined effort of housemates and other students. Eno wanted to go with them, to explain, to help, but he was held back and then led down to the dungeons. The atmosphere in Snape's office was oppressive. 2 candlesticks burned without a draft but swayed slightly, and Snape himself sat expressionless and severe. Eno looked for a way to explain, but words failed him. Whatever defense he might make would come after the fact. The damage was done. "Consider yourself forgiven, this time," Snape said slowly. "From now on, no practicing magic inside the castle. The Black Lake, the Forbidden Forest, the Quidditch pitch, those are acceptable places for you." Eno let out a quiet breath of relief. He was surprised Snape didn't press the matter further, didn't pursue harsher punishment. This was as light an outcome as he could have hoped for. He promised himself it would not happen again. Snape's voice, dry and clipped, added one more thing. "Regarding Mr. Malfoy, I will write to Mr. Lucius myself. You need not concern yourself further." "Thank you, Professor," Eno said, and meant it. If Snape hadn't taken that step, the influence of the Malfoy family might have made the situation far worse. For now, at least, that trouble had been handled, and Eno felt a small, private relief that let him breathe more easily than he had in months. Chapter 51. Malfoy was affected. He left the potions classroom office. When he returned to the Slytherin common room, Eno was met with an exceptionally warm welcome. The room was a sea of green. It was obvious that most of them had come to watch the spectacle. News in the castle was scarce. Sometimes nothing interesting happened for a week or 2. Tonight was different. A first year had been found frozen to the spot outside the dormitory and had been sent to the hospital wing, and the injured boy was the only son of the prestigious Malfoy family. That kind of explosive gossip didn't happen even over an entire school year. It was no wonder the little snakes had gathered. Eno took in the faces filling the room, the eager, scrutinizing eyes. It felt like standing before a crowd in the public square. Most people might have been intimidated, but for a bard, those things were trivial. He had performed on the grand stage of the Royal Theatre with Professor Hands. How many people were there in front of him now? He bowed slightly. "First, I apologize. This accident has disturbed your rest time." He didn't deny he had been wrong. Wrong was wrong. He made that clear immediately. But he hadn't forgotten how the prefects and older students had reacted after Malfoy's collapse. Wands out, full of righteous outrage. In a different place, in a different set of rules, they might have acted already. Yes, he'd made a mistake, but he hadn't run, and he hadn't drawn his wand. Was that worthy of an Auror's performance? Who were they performing for? Yesterday, he might have let it go quietly, smoothed things over. Today, after stirring himself all afternoon, after playing at being the White Witch, he was done tolerating those people. His gaze swept over the older students who had confronted him earlier. Then he spoke slowly. I want to say this. From beginning to end, this incident is a tragedy because someone was hurt. If anyone wants to know more, come find me, anytime. In the Forbidden Forest, in the corridor, on the Quidditch pitch, wherever. I will explain the whole thing to you in detail, one by one. Now, I need to rest. Good night, everyone. Ignoring the looks on their faces, he turned and left, walking straight to his own dormitory. He didn't know, and perhaps wouldn't have cared, what storm his words would stir up in Slytherin. If a mask stayed on too long, it did grow to the face. Back in his room, the furnishings looked perfectly restored, no doubt the work of the house elves. He wasn't fond of house elves, mostly because he didn't like the idea of someone hiding in his home, and because Dobby's betrayal had taught him not to trust them completely. One example proved that house elves weren't absolutely loyal and reliable. For someone with secrets, a servant's ability meant less than loyalty. He surveyed his tidy bed and jumped, landing perfectly on the soft mattress. Madam Weasley looks after 9 people plus a ghoul and doesn't seem exhausted. With family magic, what's there to fear from housework? He muttered, then waved his wand to snuff the candles out. He'd been through too much today and needed deep sleep to relieve the exhaustion. The dormitory fell quiet, but the castle was only beginning to stir. Hogwarts has no secrets was true in the best and worst ways. In a closed community of thousands, news spread. Tonight the owls were busy. The long unused two-way mirrors that had been gathering dust were finally put to use. In the Gryffindor common room, Ron pretended to read a newspaper on the sofa, but his alert ears gave him away. If Mrs. Weasley could see him now, she'd be surprised to find her youngest so absorbed. Then, as if all the messages had reached him at once, Ron threw the paper down and rushed for the boys' dormitory. He burst through the door with a bang. Harry! Harry! Great news! Malfoy was knocked out in his dormitory and sent to Madame Pomfrey. They say he won't live through the night. Old Malfoy fainted from crying, and the professors are talking about sending him to St. Mungo's. He talked as he walked. His loud voice carried through the dormitory and roused Neville from sleep. Neville sat up, rubbing his eyes, bewildered. Ron kept talking. Listen, Malfoy was attacked just now. The culprit's the one I told you about before, Eno, or Ian, whatever his name is. When they found Malfoy, he was frozen like an ice sculpture. Neville, listening, felt guilt flare through him. He wondered if his own actions had led to Eno attacking Malfoy. Ron was in full storyteller mode. You wouldn't believe how terrifying it was. I don't know what kind of dark arts he was doing in the dormitory. They opened the door, and countless vengeful spirits poured out, and the whole Slytherin common room fell into a biting winter. He shivered theatrically, looking around as though the ghosts might be listening. But seeing the intent faces in the room, the momentary fear faded. If Headmaster Dumbledore hadn't arrived in time, maybe the whole house would have been wiped out, Ron added, letting his imagination run wild. Harry, listening, picked out what mattered. First, Malfoy was indeed hurt and had been taken to the hospital wing. Good news for now, at least. That meant there was less immediate risk of Hagrid being blamed for other trouble with Norbert. What remained uncertain was how badly Malfoy was hurt and how long he would need to stay at Madame Pomfrey's. That information mattered because it affected their plans. As for Ron's darker pronouncements, dead, not living through the night, Harry didn't believe them. After months together, he'd learned Ron's habits. Much of what came out of his mouth was rumor, and only the occasional claim needed to be taken as truth. Everything has two sides. Where some people find joy, others find disappointment. Hogwarts School Hospital. Draco Malfoy, having received prompt treatment, lay staring at the ceiling with nothing to do. He was wrapped like a mummy, only his eyes, nose, and mouth showed between the bandages. Madame Pomfrey had diagnosed extensive frostbite and ordered him to rest quietly for at least a night. Bored, Malfoy replayed the morning over in his head. He'd pushed open the dormitory door, and the next thing he knew, he'd woken up in the hospital. What on earth is Eno doing? He's really caused a mess, he muttered, thinking back to Harry and Hagrid's secret dragon. Time passed. While some had been up all night in excitement, others had slept soundly. Eno opened his eyes in the early morning, sat up, and stretched. After a night of deep sleep, he felt unusually refreshed. He intended to visit Malfoy. The whole incident had started because of him, and Draco had been an unfortunate bystander, but he hesitated over what to bring. Visiting with a gift was a habit he couldn't shake. All he could find in his trunk was a bag of galleons and a handful of frostbitten berries. Berries were out. Those would be poison, not a present. Gold had no point. Malfoy wasn't the sort to be impressed by coins. Flowers, Eno decided. He wished he didn't have to rely on clumsy transfiguration in the middle of winter, and pulled out his wand. 5 shimmering ice arrows formed in midair then. Instead of firing them, he molded them together like clay, stretching, kneading, reshaping. A minute later, 5 pale blue lilies, carved from ice, glistened in his hand. It was a new trick born from last night's practice. He could change the shape of ice while keeping its volume. The more he used his magic, the better his control over ice and snow became. It felt natural, like a fish settling into water. Ice lilies weren't perfect, but in winter, they would last longer than a transfigured bouquet. Down the corridor outside the hospital, Harry and Hermione paced, waiting. Hermione was fidgety. "Harry, you mustn't be like him," she scolded suddenly, tossing her bushy hair back. Knowing it's a dragon and teasing it anyway, he deserved to be bitten. Harry could only nod helplessly. Earlier that morning, Ron had been so excited to tell Hagrid about Malfoy's hospitalization that he dragged Harry along. In the chaos, Ron had mistaken Norbert's head for fangs and reached out to pat it. The dragon responded exactly like a dragon. It bit Ron, swelling his hand to twice its normal size. Hagrid had pulled Ron away before things got worse, but Ron had ended up in the hospital too. Harry sighed at the absurdity. He'd never thought he'd see days like this. "I never thought Malfoy would end up here," he added. "And now they're even in the same hospital wing. Slytherin's a strange place." Hermione bristled. "Don't say that. Eno must have had his reasons. I believe him." "Eno?" Harry asked. "We met in London," Hermione said quickly, as if that settled it. "We're quite good friends," Harry shrugged. It wasn't surprising Hermione had friends in other houses. Their impatience grew with every minute until footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. Harry turned, then froze. Hermione's eyes went wide. She ran forward. Eno halted as well, surprised to find them there. From a distance, small, hurried feet pounded toward them. "Are you all right? I heard you attacked Malfoy, but I believe you. Why are you here? Do you need help?" Hermione nearly burst out in relief and concern as she reached him. Eno's lips twitched in a smile. Hermione's earnestness warmed him. She'd been a customer of his once, and a friend in the library, blunt and stubborn, but polite when it mattered. "I'm fine," he said. "The thing with Malfoy was an accident. I'm actually here to visit him. What about you two?" Harry gave a strained smile, while Hermione, now reassured, relaxed. "We were waiting for someone else. Ron. He got bitten too. We came to check on him." Hermione's gaze drifted to the lilies in Eno's hand. The ice flowers were pale blue, clear and delicate. Everyone could see they weren't ordinary, and she couldn't hide her admiration. Eno noticed her looking and, amused, offered one. "Do you like them?" he asked. "Here, Miss Granger." He plucked a lily of solidified ice from the bundle and handed it to Hermione. She took it with delighted surprise, cradling the cool petals as if they were the most precious thing. Chapter 53. The Second Hogwarts Divination. Hermione stood before the ice-blue lilies, uncharacteristically hesitant. She clasped her hands lightly behind her back, head bowed, and bit her lip as if lost in thought, or perhaps to hide a flutter of nerves. One foot nudged at a shoelace. She simply wouldn't reach out to touch the bouquet. Eno, amused at the sight of Hermione acting shy, understood immediately. He double-checked the flowers to make sure they were lilies and not roses, then without a word, took Hermione's hand and laid the stems in her palm. "Here, take them. They're made of ice, so when you want them back, use a levitation charm. If you leave them outside your window, they'll keep blooming all winter." "All right, I'm going to visit Malfoy. See you," Eno said, then headed for the hospital wing. As he passed Harry, he nodded. Harry gave a strained, half-hearted smile in return. In the hospital wing, Eno found Malfoy, wrapped in bandages like a mummy. The sight pricked at his conscience. Malfoy turned his head at the sound of footsteps, and recognizing Eno, broke into a brilliant smile. Even with his face swathed in bandages, the curve of his mouth made it obvious. Then Malfoy's eyes fell on the bouquet. The smile slipped away, and he visibly shivered. "Sorry, Draco." Eno hurriedly dispelled the enchantment on the lilies. He'd been a bit thoughtless. Malfoy had frostbite, and ice flowers were a terrible thing to give him. "I'm fine," Malfoy said after the flowers faded, his tone casual but a little clipped. Then, as if embarrassed at his own unease, he added, "But please do me a favor. Next time you practice magic in the dorm, tell me beforehand, will you?" "There won't be a next time. I won't practice in the dorm again, and Professor Snape already spoke to me privately," Eno said firmly. The promise seemed to put Malfoy at ease. He relaxed, then grew curious and a little concerned. "Professor Snape? He didn't give you a hard time, did he? If there's any trouble, I can write to my father." Even bandaged and arrogant, Malfoy's manner was unmistakable. Eno smiled inwardly. How could anyone dislike someone who, even in a hospital bed, still thought first of others? He felt a strange warmth toward Malfoy in that moment. "No trouble," Eno replied. "Snape just told me not to practice in the dorm anymore." They chatted idly, much like old times when they'd sat on opposite beds in the dormitory. 15 minutes later, Madame Pomfrey arrived, and citing the need to change bandages, politely ushered Eno out. In the corridor, he ran into Hermione and Harry again. Harry's expression was different now, hesitant, like he wanted to speak. Eno glanced at them. "Why are you still here?" Hermione jabbed Harry with her elbow, annoyed at his inaction. "We need to talk to you," she said, then turned to Eno. "It's him. He wants you to do a divination. What do you think?" Harry stepped forward, stumbling over his words. "Hello. Hermione says your readings are very accurate. I was wondering if you could you do one for me?" Watching Harry fumble, Eno interrupted with a dry smile. "I mostly tell stories now, but since Hermione's a former client, I'll consider her feelings." He paused so Hermione could preen a little. "So, Mr. Potter, one divination is 5 sickles. 5 sickles." Eno had chosen that price after thought. It matched the small fee he'd once charged back in Muggle school. Harry's eyes widened, then he blurted, "Of course, I'll pay now." He began patting his pockets in a panic, growing even more flustered the more he fussed. Coins slipped and clinked, and at last he stood there holding a messy handful of money, looking pitiful. Eno couldn't help laughing. He plucked a galleon from Harry's pile and said, "I'll give you change. I owe you 12 sickles. But first, we need somewhere quiet to begin." They went to an abandoned classroom deep in the castle, where chairs and desks were piled in a dark corner. It felt forgotten by time. The three of them sat in a small circle in the center of the room. Eno toyed with a die. "Mr. Potter, tell me what you want to ask." Harry hesitated. Hermione, exasperated, answered for him. "Hagrid secretly raised a dragon. We need to know if Hagrid will be punished for it." She shot Harry a look. "You shouldn't hide it anymore. Malfoy saw the dragon. What's the point?" Harry nodded, suddenly resolved. Eno didn't say anything about the truth. He'd taken their money and would do the reading. He repeated the question under his breath, then flicked the die. It spun across the tabletop and came to rest with the 5 face up. Eno picked it up and looked at them. "The divination is clear. Hagrid won't be implicated or punished for secretly raising the dragon." Chapter 54. Christmas Holiday Plans. Hogwarts in December looked like a tranquil, dreamlike painting. Snowflakes drifted down, softening the castle's ancient stones, and the Black Lake had taken on a thin, glassy crust of ice. Even the humping willow seemed to have lost some of its former vigor. Its branches hung with clear icicles that flashed in the weak sunlight. Occasionally, a stray flake would slip into a corridor and melt on the flagstones with a faint, whispering sound, as if telling winter's tale to the old building. Slytherin Common Room. After signing the Christmas holiday leave form, Eno returned to the dormitory. 2 full weeks had passed since the last accidental freezing incident, and a lot had happened in those days. The biggest shock had been Gryffindor's sudden loss of 150 house points overnight. Slytherin had also been docked 50. Eno never cared much for the House Cup. The thing he really cared about was himself, or at least matters that involved him directly. Even though Malfoy had come forward to clear things up after being discharged from the hospital, Eno couldn't shake the feeling that his housemates were looking at him strangely. It wasn't outright ostracism like Hermione had once experienced, but there was a subtle distance. Apart from Malfoy, Pansy, Daphne, and a few others, most of his year treated him with a guarded unfamiliarity. In that atmosphere, staying in the common room felt awkward enough. Telling stories was out of the question. Back in the dormitory, Eno worked on his transfiguration homework and made plans for the Christmas holidays. Unlike Harry, who had nowhere to go, Eno's home was the sprawling city of London. In practice, any place could be home as long as basic needs were met, and with a few hundred galleons in his pocket, there wasn't much he couldn't afford. As long as he avoided broom travel, his money would last him a long time. "Hogsmeade it is," he murmured, "and I'll see about getting mandrake leaves while I'm there." He glanced at the transfiguration exercises in front of him and thought about the animagus research he'd been planning. Maybe he didn't yet have the power for it, but that didn't mean he couldn't start the preparatory steps. In his sources, one prerequisite for learning animagus was keeping a mandrake leaf in your mouth for a full month. No swallowing, no taking it out. If the leaf left your mouth, all previous progress was lost, and you had to start over. There were other fiddly requirements later, full moon nights and dew that hadn't seen sunlight, among other things, so some parts of the process had to be arranged well ahead of time. A single candle burned by the desk, sending a warm, steady light across the room. Eno bent over his parchment, the quill making a faint scratching as he filled line after line with neat script. A stack of textbooks for first years leaned at his left. Since the holidays were coming, there would be fewer interruptions. Finishing as much holiday work as possible in the days before leaving felt sensible. Knock! Knock, knock! A sudden knock on the dormitory door pulled him from his thoughts. He set his quill down with a small sigh of resignation. Of course it was Malfoy, home from whatever latest escapade. Malfoy had promised more than once to practice magic in the dormitory, but stubbornness ran in him. No amount of persuasion ever stuck. He always knocked first, regardless. A dozen seconds later. "Phew, I knew you were here. Every day it's either the library or your room. Keep it up and you'll be forgotten," Malfoy said cheerfully as he stepped in. "Being forgotten or not doesn't mean much," Eno replied, straightening the pile of books on his desk. "People's social lives only show their outward value. Solitude shows the inside." Malfoy looked unusually pleased. "You noticed?" He could no longer hide his grin. "Because of that point deduction, we were supposed to have night patrol in the Forbidden Forest, but I found Filch, and he said he'd ask Professor McGonagall to set me to polishing trophies instead. Only Scarhead and his 2 henchmen will be on patrol. I can't wait to see their faces when they find out. Ha!" Seeing Malfoy on the verge of self-induced glee, Eno steered the conversation. "Have you done your potions homework? There's class the day before the holiday. Don't let Professor Snape single you out." Malfoy's laugh stopped mid-chordal, turning into a fit of coughing. "Blast! It's all Scarhead and that lot's fault. Eno, can you?" "In the middle drawer," Eno said, pointing to the neat pile of parchments. "It's on the desk. Don't copy it word for word. Change a few lines. If you get something wrong, it's better than getting caught." "Ha! I knew it. Thanks, brother." Malfoy hurried to the desk and began dipping his quill in ink, ready to copy. Eno watched him for a moment, then leaned back against the headboard and let his thoughts wander. The night patrol punishment, breaking into the forest, squirrel hunting unicorns, this sort of first-year business was risky. Even if he didn't want to get involved, it seemed hazardous. Not everyone had the peculiar safeguards that seemed to cluster around Harry. Still, Eno felt some comfort remembering his talk with Dumbledore in the tower. The headmaster could monitor the whole castle at once, and under that kind of watchful eye, the monstrous things in the rumor mill felt more like props in a play than genuine, unstoppable threats. Even Fawkes's timely appearances, helping at crucial moments and producing the sorting hat, of all things, seemed too conveniently timed to be pure coincidence. Yet Dumbledore's stewardship made the castle far less terrifying. As Eno began to drift toward sleep, Malfoy spoke up again. "Oh, almost forgot. Are you free during the holidays?" My father insists we invite you to Malfoy Manor as a guest, not because of that accident. Honest, just a dinner invitation. Copying homework, it seemed, was always faster than writing it. Malfoy was already packing away his stationery. I'm sorry, Eno said, half asleep. I already have plans for the holiday. The sleepiness pressed at him, and he could feel himself nodding. Malfoy muttered under his breath. Even I got turned down. Pansy wanted me to ask, but it was pointless. Then, seeing Eno had actually fallen asleep, he let his complaint die and climbed into his own bed. The dormitory fell quiet, save for the soft crackle of the candle and the whisper of snow against the windows. 2 days slipped by in a blink. The first-year Christmas was in its final countdown. The entire castle had been transformed by magic into something out of a dream. The Great Hall's enormous tree, nearly 20 feet tall, was dressed in colorful enchanted lanterns and twinkling stars that gave off a soft, warm glow. Piles of candy boxes lay beneath it, Honeyduke's elegant wrapping paper shimmering in the light. It wasn't just the Great Hall. Corridors were strung with magically drawn snowflakes and ribbons that drifted gently in midair, as if alive, and the portraits lining the walls seemed swept up in the cheer, every subject smiling in holiday good humor. After the last potions class, Eno wandered the corridors thinking over the amusing bits he'd just seen. What he'd enjoyed most about the lesson wasn't the potion making, but the battle of wits between Snape and Harry, if battle was the right word. More often it felt like Snape's one-sided torment of Harry, and watching Snape maintain that poker face while he taunted, mocked, and ridiculed was comic regardless of perspective. A portrait nearby summed it up in one of its captions. I doubt old Potter ever imagined that the trouble he caused would one day be paid back by his son. Halfway through the hall, Eno stopped. A corridor he hadn't noticed before lay open ahead. He was sure he had taken the usual route back to the dormitory after class, yet here he was. He stepped forward. Curiosity was only mild, but the corridor felt like a quiet invitation. It stretched maybe 150 meters. He could see the end in the dim, enchanted light. After covering more than half the distance, he noticed nothing unusual, just a long marble floor, a few scattered portraits, the usual suits of armor. If anything stood out, it was the extra cobwebs on the armor and frames, like an old room neglected for years. About to turn back, he spotted a worn brown wooden door on his left. He pushed it open and found an abandoned classroom. Unlike the other unused rooms that were merely empty, this one was decrepit. Benches and chairs were broken and stacked in a chaotic heap, plaster flaked from the walls, and dust motes hung thick in the air. Yet among the ruin there was a strange, incongruous object, a 10-foot mirror, exquisitely crafted and standing untouched. Its dark wooden frame was carved with meticulous, time-worn detail. On the base beneath the glass, letters were embossed in backward script, enough for him to recognize the mirror at once. He knew it immediately. The Mirror of Erised, the enchanted glass that shows a person their deepest desire. The recognition also explained why he'd been drawn here without noticing the route. Something had led him. "Since I'm here," he murmured and approached. He stood before the mirror. For a moment, a faint glow played across the surface and a misty haze formed, as if the glass was waking up. But the scene he expected didn't appear. Instead, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Frost crawled across the mirror, and soon the entire face of the glass was sheathed in ice. Eno blinked, taken aback. "Did I break it?" he asked aloud. No, it's not broken, just frozen." The voice came from the doorway. Eno turned and saw the familiar figure of the headmaster, robes dusted with snow from the corridor, his blue eyes crinkling with amusement. "Good day, headmaster," Eno said before he could stop himself. "Don't be so formal," Dumbledore replied with a smile. "No need for that." "All right, as you wish," Eno shrugged. Titles mattered less now. Time had changed his view of the rules. And Dumbledore was not the sort of man to inspire fear. He'd always been kind in his own, quietly wise way. He couldn't resist teasing, though. "So can it be fixed? I didn't mean to damage or freeze it, and if it's truly broken, I can't promise I have the money to pay for repairs." Dumbledore laughed, softly and entirely without malice. "No need to pay. A simple healing charm will do." He raised his wand and with a few graceful movements murmured an incantation. The frost evaporated as if time reversed itself. The mirror cleared and shone as it had when Eno first saw it. Chairs and a small pile of candy appeared as well, like something conjured for company. It is meaningless to lose oneself in illusions and neglect reality, Dumbledore said, his gaze wandering to the mirror as if weighing what it might reveal. And yet some people, surprisingly, live by that dream and are all the more lost for it. Would you like to hear a story? Seeing the chairs and the candy, completely harmless and oddly familiar, like a quiet memory, Eno didn't resist. He pulled a chair up and sat. All right, Professor. I tell stories most of the time, but I enjoy listening too. Dumbledore smiled, pleased, and settled opposite him. Eno popped a toffee into his mouth. It was the same sweet taste as the one sold at Honeyduke's. The two of them sat in the faded classroom, the holiday magic from the corridors muffling the rest of the castle to a soft hush. I have lived more than 100 years, Dumbledore began, and I have met many people, some gifted in divination and prophecy. Most of them accepted what they were shown and let it guide them. But there are a few, rare, who refuse to be bound by what they are told. They break the pattern and make their own way. Eno interrupted almost at once. Seeking advantage and avoiding harm is human nature. Diviners simply see possibilities more clearly and make choices from knowledge. Dumbledore nodded, not displeased. Yes, people are quick to define others. You must love this. You must hate that. They forget to ask the person involved. Fate has a way of sounding inevitable because we give it a voice. But knowing possible futures doesn't absolve you of choosing. It complicates the choice, perhaps, but it does not replace it. The two fell into a companionable silence. Outside, somewhere in the castle, a portrait burst into mirthful laughter, and the faint jangle of carols drifted down the corridor. The mirror of Erised stood quiet and clear behind them, reflecting Dumbledore's thoughtful face and Eno's, each looking for a moment, like someone deciding what they truly wanted. Chapter 56, Second Communication with the Principal. Professor, seeking advantage and avoiding danger is human nature. The difference is that diviners can see it clearly and therefore make choices accordingly. When Dumbledore finished, Eno shot back immediately. Do you know? Over the past few months at Hogwarts, I've wandered the corridors and found a very interesting portrait. He calls himself Sir Cagendo. You must know his story, which is why I say we can't expect everyone to be like this brave sir, throwing themselves into a dragon's mouth without hesitation. Eno trailed off. He was now almost certain that the divination he'd performed on Harry earlier had been observed by some covert surveillance. He had his suspicions about Dumbledore's ability to watch the castle in real time, which was why he deliberately used Sir Cagendo as an example. Dumbledore chuckled and blinked. "Ha! That's right! The portraits told me about you divining for Harry." The frankness of the response, like legitimacy but unexpectedly candid, left Eno momentarily off guard. "Professor, actually no need to explain. Just assume I wanted to tell you these things. And don't worry, this isn't legitimacy," Dumbledore interjected. Before Eno could reply, the headmaster's voice took on a slightly puzzled tone. "Your magic seems very peculiar. It's as if it protects you. Anything that tries to pry into your mind, whether wizard or alchemical instrument, is repelled. The frozen mirror of Erised is the best evidence." Special magic? Eno was taken aback at first, but then he realized Dumbledore was probably right. After all, while the mirror of Erised reflects a person's innermost desires, it is, in another sense, a kind of invasive gaze. "Professor, I don't understand what you mean," he admitted. When faced with profound matters, he always asked if he didn't understand. That's perfectly normal. No one fully comprehends the mysteries of magic, not even me. But you can be reassured of one thing. Your situation is unusual, yes, but benign, a kind of protective magic. Dumbledore's tone softened, as if recalling something dear, like the Dumbledore family, who always seem to receive help from the Phoenix when they need it most. "Protective magic? Bloodline?" Eno murmured, mulling it over. He had a rough idea of the cause, but new doubts sprang up. Perhaps extreme emotion really was nothing more than self-indulgence? Yet the thought also fit what he knew of the White Witch's temperament, someone who could be set aflame by a story, who might do unbelievable things on impulse. An empress, perhaps, who acts as she pleases. Relief, suspicion, curiosity, confusion. These thoughts crowded at the edges of his mind like weeds that wouldn't be pulled out. Dumbledore, it seemed, truly did possess legitimacy. He read Eno's uncertainty and suggested, "Why not set aside what you don't understand for now? Leave it for later." "Professor, I'm not obsessed with finding answers. Some things simply have none," Eno began, then froze mid-sentence. That remark had slipped out of him unconsciously, a leftover phrase from years of performing as a bard. But the more he considered it, the more it felt true. Some questions might never be answered. Dumbledore spread his hands, looking almost innocent. "Look, I don't even have to convince you. You've convinced yourself." "Eno, no matter what you've seen, what I want to say is that everything that happens in the future is meant to happen," Dumbledore added. Eno felt the fatalism in the words, but did not accept it. The future was not fixed, and standing by and mouthing a few philosophical lines would not change much. He thought of the real reasons behind Dumbledore's choices, the longing for family, decades of weariness, and how, even for one of the greatest wizards of their age, that longing might outweigh reason. Perhaps familial affection had triumphed over caution. The image of the centenarian stepping into another perilous path made Eno sigh. "All right, I respect your choices. I respect everyone's choices. Thank you, Eno." Neither needed to say more. They both understood the unspoken meaning. After a moment, Dumbledore leaned forward as if he had just remembered something else. "I saw your name on the holiday registration form. If you can't find lodging in Hogsmeade, or if you need anything else, write to me." Eno's eyes brightened. He had a practical problem that, while not dire, required a solution. "Professor, can you help with anything? If so, I could really use your assistance." The Christmas holiday arrived as scheduled. After politely turning down invitations from Malfoy, Pansy, Hermione, and Neville, Eno stuck to his plan and went to Hogsmeade alone to spend his first Christmas in the wizarding world. The path from Hogwarts to Hogsmeade was a quiet cobblestone lane. Eno carried his suitcase in his left hand and the Elder Wand in his right, strolling and casually waving the wand through the air. Wherever the tip passed, clusters of white snowflakes swirled into being, and after hanging for a moment, drifted down to join the snow piled along the roadside. "It's like a childhood dream, an infinitely powered bubble gun," he thought, watching the little flakes tumble away. This snow trick was something he'd just figured out, one of the second-level charms left to him by the White Witch. Making snowflakes fall wasn't just pretty, it helped him adapt to ice and snow. In short, it was useful and entertaining at the same time. Ever since he learned it, he'd been scattering snowflakes everywhere he went, everywhere except classrooms and the library at least. Filch, the castle caretaker, found it obnoxious. After a gentle intervention from Professor Flitwick and Dumbledore, however, it had been reframed as adding to the Christmas spirit and even earned him a few extra points. The matter was never fully settled. Filch still appeared whenever Eno lingered in a corridor, banging a mop on a bucket and making thinly veiled complaints as if to say, "I can't stop you, but I'll make your presence unbearable." Faced with such petty theatrics, Eno generally backed down. After all, Harry confronted Snape. Squabbling with Filch seemed beneath him. Time passed quietly as he walked, and soon Hogsmeade came into view. He welcomed the idea of a village of wizards. Here, the Ministry's trace didn't apply, and the statute of secrecy felt less like a restriction and more like a courtesy. People could practice magic in public without having to hide. As he drew nearer, the whole village opened up before him. Timbered, medieval buildings lining both sides of the street, each one decorated for Christmas. Bells, tiny presents, miniature hats, and moving snowmen dotted the storefronts. In many small ways, the village felt even more festive than Hogwarts itself. The first shop he passed was Gladrag's Wizardwear. He glanced at his Hogwarts robe, pushed open the door, and stepped inside. The shop was spacious and full of clothes in neat rows. Gladrag's was a well-known international chain. Its selection put Madame Malkin's in Diagon Alley to shame. From robes to pajamas and weird socks, everything was on display. "Merry Christmas. Welcome to Gladrag's Wizardwear, Hogsmeade branch," a clear-voiced saleswoman chirped. Eno turned to see a thin, freckled young woman. "Merry Christmas. I'd like 2 everyday robes. Any recommendations?" "Of course. We have plenty," she said with a smile. But what kind of style are you after? Plain, solid color, no embellishments. Dark gray or brown, he replied in one breath, and 2 pairs of thick cashmere socks. Half an hour later, he walked back onto the main street wearing something different. His standard Hogwarts robe was gone, replaced by a gray hooded longshirt, a cross between a cloak and a tunic with sleeves. It was well made, but it had cost him 9 galleons and 12 sickles. He couldn't deny the fit and finish, but it was the sort of thing a Muggle tailor could have made. He felt a little ripped off. Brand name, he told himself. Still, the new garment was comfortable, and he hadn't come to Hogsmeade to haggle forever, so he moved on to find a place to stay. Hogsmeade lived up to its name. Walking the main street from one end to near the other took him less than 15 minutes at a leisurely pace. The village wasn't large. The number of wizards in Britain had never been enormous, but it was definitely populated. The idea that there were only a few thousand wizards in the whole Isles felt absurd when you looked at the lit windows and homes clustered nearby. The main street rolled past like a storybook. Before long, he spotted the 3 Broomsticks. The pub was comfortably busy for the holidays. No crush, but lively enough. A new face, and such a handsome lad, came a voice before he'd taken more than a step inside. First-time customers get a free drink, non-alcoholic, of course. I'd hate to receive a howler from your mother. Madame Rosmerta, the pub's owner, had materialized beside him. She was middle-aged, the lines at the corners of her eyes betraying her years, but the sort of warmth and polish that comes from experience made her attractive in a way youth alone cannot match. "Thank you," Eno said, smiling. "Actually, I'd like to stay here for a while, through the Christmas holiday. Do you have any vacant rooms?" Rosmerta's smile widened as she looked him over. "I'll see what I can do. Come in and we'll talk about it." Chapter 58, Purchasing and Distributing Gifts. The guest rooms at the 3 Broomsticks were a world away from the cramped cells at the Leaky Cauldron. A single room here easily outclassed Old Tom's, and Madame Rosmerta had gone out of her way to deck them all for Christmas. Holly on the mantel, tinsel in the corners, and a 2-foot-tall miniature tree standing at the foot of the bed. In the warm quiet of the room, Eno felt himself relax. He stood at the window and watched Hogsmeade under the night sky, the shops lit with colorful magical lights that swayed and shimmered. The scene held him there longer than he expected. He thought, not for the first time, that sometimes the pleasure of watching other people's excitement is itself a kind of rare experience. Participation isn't always necessary to feel joy. Perhaps that was why the matron at the orphanage would sit and smile as the children played. It wasn't boredom, but a different sort of contentment. He didn't notice how long he'd been standing until the streetlights began to go out. Turning back, he sat on the bed and opened his suitcase. This time, when the case popped open, there wasn't the usual double expansion. Instead, a dark, deep void yawned inside. He put a foot into the case and felt solid steps under his shoe, then stepped down. From the corridor, it must have looked like the suitcase was swallowing him. In fact, Dumbledore had helped him with the undetectable extension charm before the holidays. Extension charms, as advanced and spatially mysterious magic, were not something Eno could learn properly in a short time, and even if he could manage something crude, he'd never risk expanding his own luggage. Aside from safety, the Ministry forbade private use of the spell. Having Dumbledore do it made a world of difference. If he didn't shove the case under Fudge's nose, Fudge would have had every excuse not to see it. The same mistake committed by different people often drew different consequences. A dozen seconds later, he was inside. It wasn't Newt's sort of city-sized space, but Dumbledore's modifications had given it almost 10,000 square feet, roughly the size of 2 to 3 basketball courts. Not enormous, but enough to build a small house and plant a bit of a garden with flowers, herbs, and some fruit trees near the entrance. That wasn't why he was here now, though. He'd come to fetch a bedtime read, the little book about sunlight that Pansy had sent before the holidays. Time moved quickly. By dawn the next morning, the first pale ray slipped across the window frame and into the room. Eno woke slowly, watching the soft morning light spread. He'd stayed up the night before to finish the thin book, less than half an inch, and had a better idea of the so-called sunlight charm. It was roughly a variant of the Patronus in the way it tied to emotion. The charm required a very particular mood to cast. Morning's gentle glow, the searing heat of midday, the nostalgic sorrow of sunset. Sunlight magic reflected the caster's feelings, changing with them. Interestingly, dark wizards could not cast it. He thought of that as he picked up his wand. Sunlight resurface. The wand tip flickered like an old tungsten bulb with shaky voltage, then steadied and brightened over a few seconds. What bloomed at the tip was the kind of morning light that comes before 8 o'clock, soft, warm, and not at all blinding. Satisfied, he dismissed it, sat up, stretched, and went to the washroom to start his morning routine. The case's interior might have been expanded, but it still needed provisioning. He didn't intend to buy anything large or conspicuous, but candies, snacks, some dried foods, herbs, tree seeds, and a few practical items would be useful. Half an hour later, he left the 3 broomsticks with his suitcase. Today he had a plan and walked with purpose down the wide street, honeydukes for long storable sweets, scriven shafts for books and parchment and ink, dervish and banges, the apothecary. Shopping and browsing were 2 different things. Once he started, he moved quickly. In less than 2 hours, he'd bought a stock of durable candies, several books, paper, ink, fruit tree seeds, and a whole bag of fresh mandrake leaves. There were no proper flying brooms for sale in Hogsmeade. The only broom he found was in Zonko's, a toy called the Wild Broom priced at 23 galleons. It was a prank broom. Try to ride it and it would flip you head down. Then cycle through 5 modes: wild spinning, sudden braking, throwing riders off, and other tricks. For safety, it only rose about 3 meters. He didn't get what he'd wanted, but he saw all sorts of curious contraptions. Wizards were tough. Many of those devices would have been dangerous in the Muggle world. His last stop was the Owl Post. He had Christmas gifts to send and a list in his head. Malfoy, Dumbledore, Pansy, Hermione, Neville. He pushed the door open and was met by 100 wide, bright eyes. Owls perched on shelves along both walls. Great horned, barn, tiny screech owls, even snowy owls, easily a couple of hundred in all. At the sound of the door, they all tilted their heads in unison and fixed him with curious, innocent stares, as if he'd walked into a small, enchanted zoo. Chapter 59. The 3 Broomsticks. Hundreds of owls sat in perfect rows, each one oddly charming and somehow comical. Eno couldn't help stealing a few extra glances before making his way up to the counter. "Excuse me, madam, I'd like to rent an owl to deliver a parcel," he said. Behind the counter, the only wizard on duty in the entire post office was a gaunt, middle-aged witch, her nose buried in a book titled Breaking Up with a Ghost. "Pick a suitable one yourself. Deliveries within England are 5 nuts per parcel, 2 nuts for letters. We're not responsible if anything gets lost." She never once looked up. The book seemed more important than the whole office. Her brusque tone was a far cry from the friendlier shopkeepers he'd met in Hogsmeade, but the difference made sense. This was an official ministry operation, not a private business. Eno slapped a sickle on the counter and began choosing. For this run, he selected 5 sturdier owls to serve as messengers. He wrapped and tied the parcels, then felt a soft tug at his right sleeve. Looking down, he met a patch of fluffy gray-white feathers and a round face with big, earnest eyes that peered at his fingers like a child hoping for candy. Without hesitation, he scooped the little owl up and brought it back to the counter. "I'll buy this one," he said. The Owl Post did more than send mail. It sold birds, too, an extra service, like a public booth that happened to sell handsets. At the word buy, the witch finally set her book aside. The freckled woman's indifference evaporated, replaced by a sudden, businesslike enthusiasm. "Tawny owls. Very clever," she said, eyes bright. "They hunt for mice and pixies on their own, don't need much tending, and they're fiercely loyal. And they fly well." She rattled off the price. 27 galleons and 11 sickles, and that includes 2 bags of standard owl food. Add 5 sickles if you want a cage or a perch. Outside, Eno stroked the owl on his shoulder. "I'll call you Little Guy," he murmured. "I used to have one like you, but it got lost." The owl nuzzled his cheek with its cool beak in reply, an oddly affectionate, matter-of-fact gesture. It had the sort of personality you'd expect of an owl that spent its days at the post office, efficient, a little worldly, and astonishingly attuned to people. He'd only meant to send a few parcels, but somehow had come away with a companion, and he didn't regret it. Sometimes a connection simply happened. Satisfied that he'd left nothing behind, Eno headed to the Three Broomsticks. Late morning found the village busier than usual. Christmas holidays brought visitors from all over, and the pub hummed with foreign accents and the smell of roast meats. Madame Rosmerta, spotting him, raised an eyebrow and teased. Well, didn't realize you were a rich young master. Bought an owl this morning, did you? Maybe I should raise the rent on your room." Little Guy perked up at the word owl and gave a small, conspiratorial swipe in the air, as if greeting the insinuation. "That one cost me 5 years' pocket money," Eno said with a laugh. "If you try to raise the rent, I might have to find other ways to pay." Madame Rosmerta pouted theatrically. After running the Three Broomsticks for over a decade, she knew when a joke was a bluff. "All right, show me then. How will you pay? If you've got no money, I'll toss you out. No exceptions." "Don't worry," Eno answered. "You might end up owing me." He grabbed Little Guy and went upstairs. A few minutes later, he returned carrying an accordion. With Madame Rosmerta's tacit approval and the amused curiosity of several patrons, he settled in a small open space near the bar, a spot people usually use to pass to the kitchens. Then he began to play. A slow, plaintive melody filled the room. "Are you going to Scarborough Fair? Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme." In a village that felt like a slice of medieval life, Eno had chosen well. The tune suited the stone walls and low wooden beams of the Three Broomsticks. His voice was clear and otherworldly, and the accordion's husky timbre wrapped the melody in a gentle melancholy. As the last note died away, the pub fell into a hushed silence. Madame Rosmerta was first to speak, eyes shining. "That was stirring. Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. Each is a token of love, strength, loyalty, and courage." She turned to him. "Isn't there a tragic story behind that song?" Eno let a small smile play at his lips, drawing people in with a melody, then dropping them into a tale. That was a bard's tried-and-true method. He eased into the story, voice low at first and then building, guiding the room's attention. "It's an old song," he said. "Centuries back, in the Middle Ages, bards carried it from village to village. It tells of a lone, kinless sailor, some say a pirate, who'd been captured. Given a single request before the executioner took him, he asked passers-by to go to Scarborough Fair, find his beloved, and tell her that he would soon be gone." He let the image hang in the air, the melody still echoing in people's ears. The patrons listened, as if the song had reached into some long, secret place inside them. Exactly the kind of hush a good story deserved. It was evening when Eno pushed open the door to his room. He had spent the entire afternoon telling stories in the hall downstairs. His body was a little tired, but his spirit felt satisfied. Being a bard had never been some rigid identity for him. When he'd first come to this world, fate had led him to Hans, another bard, and to survive he'd adopted the same trade. If he'd met a knight instead, he might now call himself an apprentice or a squire. Over time, though, he'd grown to like it. What had started as a means of survival, singing, telling stories, doing a little divination for coin, had become a hobby, something he did because it made him happy. "From beginning to end, you have never been a constraint to me. This is merely a hobby," he thought, staring at the accordion by the bed. He'd sometimes considered changing his path, trying scholarship, divination in earnest, adventuring, or even sailing. But at 12, a scholar or a half-grown adventurer felt implausible. He smiled at the thought and sank onto the bed, lying half on his side so he could let himself relax. In that comfortable, semi-conscious state, his thoughts drifted through the years. The orphanage, the first bewildering days in this new world, fragments before that. Sometimes he felt unexpectedly grown up. At other moments, he felt like a child. Life could seem finished and brand new at once, like a long story that ends only to open another chapter full of hints for what's to come. Exhaustion won out, and he fell asleep. The 2-week Christmas holiday passed quietly and pleasantly. Mornings after breakfast, he stayed in his room to practice magic, transfiguration, basic light charms, and some simple ice spells. After an afternoon nap, he went down to the hall to tell stories and sing. In 2 weeks, he'd picked up a small following in Hogsmeade and even caught the attention of a few papers. One included a letter from the Daily Prophet requesting he come in for an interview. He'd laughed, tossed the letter into the fireplace, and watched it burn. The request felt as grand as a plea from a self-published author. He'd packed early, the same single suitcase he arrived with, still unopened. His owl, clever little thing, had already flown back to Hogwarts ahead of him. Hogwarts, Slytherin common room. He slipped through the gap in the wall and returned to the familiar green and silver space. The quiet, slightly distant looks from other students made him want to be anywhere else, so he headed straight for the dormitory. He pushed the door open and found his owl perched on its stand, frowning in a way that suggested bewilderment rather than welcome, and a pile of Christmas gifts stacked by the bed. He rubbed his forehead and started opening the parcels. There was no strict custom in England to return every gift, but for anything valuable, it was customary to show some gratitude. He unwrapped and read notes, unwrapped and read more notes, until half an hour later the pile had been sorted. Most were ordinary, chocolates and sweets, but some were thoughtful or valuable. Professor Flitwick's standard book of spells for third year, Hermione's bottle of Penhaligon's men's cologne, Dumbledore's copy of the Tales of Beetle the Bard. The most extravagant was Malfoy's, a 3-inch Quidditch star carved from solid gold. It had no flashy magic, couldn't float or glow, but over 2 pounds of gold made up for that. Humans, he thought, did have an instinctive love of gold. He rolled the little statue between his fingers for a while before putting it away. He looked at the sweets and snacks then, beautifully packaged treats that would have once been a child's dream in the orphanage. A memory surfaced of older students who had made life difficult for those without means. He couldn't bring himself to eat them, but he wouldn't throw them away either. He rose decisively and left the room. In the common room, a cluster of students fell silent as he approached. Malfoy had even come out to explain himself earlier, but the awkwardness remained. Eno tried not to notice and called out, "Goyle!" Like a student summoned by a professor, Goyle jumped up immediately. "I'm here, Mr. Swinburne." Eno felt a weary fondness for him. "Come with me. I've got something for you. Don't be scared. They're just Christmas sweets." At the word food, Goyle's near tearful expression vanished and was replaced by fierce, simple delight, as if he would eat his fill and feel vindicated forever. Back in the dormitory, Eno sat in a chair while the pile of sweets disappeared into Goyle's hands. He didn't bear the boy any malice. Goyle was straightforward and uncomplicated, and likely would be so his whole life. Crabbe, by contrast, felt different. There was something about him that suggested a deeper power and a potential he kept hidden. The fact that a small wizard could even whisper about things like fiendfire before graduating made Eno wonder what was disguise and what was truth, but he had no desire to pry. Knowing the future didn't change the present. There had been so many prophets in history, none of them micromanaged every life. They only pointed the ship in a general direction. Perhaps the truest respect for life is to allow each thing to grow in its own way. Let flowers bloom, let trees rise tall, each unique, each living as it must. He watched Goyle eat and thought how odd and fragile and ordinary everything was, and how enough simple kindness could make the world a little better. The holiday was over. The new term would start soon.